Between position battles and veterans in the secondary, there is a lot going on for the Cincinnati Bengals defense in training camp as they look to right the ship. Let's break it all down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. Today, we get into a training camp preview on the defensive side of the ball. We just went through the offense. The day before that, we talked about Joe Burrow and Dan Pitcher and the offensive scheme changes that we're looking for. Today, we get into questions all over this defense that we're looking for some answers for throughout training camp. In this episode, brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a daily booster bonus this summer. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Check it out at FanDuel.com to get started. And James, when we look at this defense that was maligned by communication issues last year, by explosive plays, there is quite a bit of personnel changes on this side of the ball. From veteran safeties they've imported to start, most likely, to replace Dax Hill, move him to corner. Battle now is battling for a starting spot.
Jordan Battle, yeah.
Jordan Battle, not his brother, Jalen Battle.
Yep. Jalen Battle may try to make the team, but he's not going to start. I'll tell you that.
The safety veterans, I think, are where we start with looking at this defense. There are some interesting position battles. We'll talk about the defensive line as well, but they bring in these veteran safeties. The safeties under so much scrutiny late last season into the beginning of the offseason, and they aggressively go out and get a safety and then bring back Vonn Bell for practically free when the Panthers cut him.
Yep. And I think the hope here is obviously that you don't give up the big plays that you did last year, those explosive plays, those deep plays. Everyone remembers the George Pickens catch and run, but there were plenty of others where it was just the Texans game is a really good example. Joe Burrow's last fully healthy game, and it was explosive play city, and they gave up a lot of them, and the Texans moved right down the field after the Bengals tied it. You can't have that. And so getting a Geno Stone and then sort of stumbling into Vonn Bell, I don't think that they expected to add two safeties that are starting level safeties going into free agency. But when you can get Vonn Bell for the minimum, have the Panthers pay him, his familiarity. I know for a fact veterans on that team are so excited that Vonn Bell is back from a communication standpoint, familiarity standpoint, obviously what he brings on the field. It's reasonable to expect the safety room to be exactly what Lou and exactly what this defense, what they're hoping for and what they were looking for last year from Nick Scott and Dax Hill, at least by the end of the year. And it just never really came together. My expectations are high for the safety room, because even if you say, you're not as high on Vonn Bell, well, then you mentioned him. There's Jordan Battle right there. And I think of those two guys, I think Bell has the clear edge. We've talked about this. But of those two guys, can one of them, along with Geno Stone, stabilize the safety room? They better, because that's my expectation and then some.
Obviously, they practice together in the offseason program, so it's not like it's the first time they will have experience practicing together, but it's a full time. We'll get eventually padded practices and a little bit more contact in practices as we get later into training camp in a couple of weeks, and seeing these guys playing next to each other, seeing if we see the early returns. Do we get praise from the coaches? Do we get veterans commenting about how much better communication is? It's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing to see on the field at all times, but something that we will be watching, of course, during the 11-on-11 periods, even the 7-on-7 periods of practice, to see if there are clear communication breakdowns, clear coverage busts in practice. And that's something that was discussed so much last year by this coaching staff and by those who evaluate film closely. How many coverage busts, how much communication could be to blame for some of those issues. That's really something that Geno Stone and Vonn Bell or Jordan Battle, whoever shakes out there, need to fix and need to get a start on fixing right away in training camp. The ideal case here is that we hear about how well this is going and how night and day it is compared to last year, like where perhaps there were some issues where you hear about, they're coming along, they're young players, this sort of thing, to there's that clear veteran presence back there. We have everybody on the same page. Things
Yep.
are exactly where they need to be.
Yeah, and I think you're already hearing that with Vonn. And that's the good news. Now, it's from guys that have played with Vonn in the past. So you still have to go out there, still need him and Geno to be in sync and do what, again, I think we're all expecting them to do. At the same time, last year, there was a ripple effect for sure. And the trust with Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt clearly was frayed a bit from what was behind them or what was happening behind them. So hopefully they can build that up in camp as well, and Geno's obviously established, right? Even more established than a Nick Scott, because he had 7 interceptions last year. You're more familiar with him because of the Ravens ties and all of those things. But earning that trust in camp, I do think that's important. And I do think, especially during these joint practices, when all of those guys, you would expect them to be out there, that's when that can be done, where they can earn 55's trust and earn 57's trust, and Pratt and Wilson don't necessarily have to worry. Because I do think especially by the end of last year, they were worrying, whether they tried to or not, what was going on behind them, and if they were doing the right things to make sure that what's going on behind them didn't impact and lead to big plays.
Yeah, eliminating that ripple effect and the top-down effect that had on the defense is certainly part of the goal there. And trust, communication, the ability to make the plays on the football field, these are all things that they're hoping are better with 2 new starters, likely, at those positions. I guess on that note, I know we've talked about this, Vonn Bell, Jordan Battle, ostensibly in a battle for that strong safety role, that second safety role, along with Geno Stone, who everyone has penciled in as a starter at this point. No reason not to. Penned in as a starter, written in Sharpie, whatever you want to say. How much of a battle do you anticipate, James, for Vonn Bell and Jordan Battle for that other starting spot?
I'd be surprised if it's the main battle we're focused on. And it's weird that we keep saying battle and we're talking about Jordan Battle. And I think it's because of all that trust, all of those factors. It's just there. Like, Vonn's been there, done that. Like, where he's going to be. And I do think last year, everyone talks about Dax. I think Jordan was working through some things with his coaching staff last year too. And it wasn't perfect, even though the PFF grade is what it is. It doesn't mean he's not going to play, by the way. And that doesn't mean in his mind he shouldn't think he's going to start and try to start and push to start. In fact, I think he's been training, and he is training up until July 20th is what he told me, away from the facility. But basically a month straight in Texas. So there was no vacation. There was no trip. There was all these guys go on vacation. At least Jordan didn't, from what I know. He told me he had no plans of going on vacation. So he's pretty locked in.
No backless suit for Jordan Battle?
No backless suit. No. And look, I think if that's the mindset he has to have, if he wants to have a real shot here at pushing Vonn Bell and winning that starting job. Is it possible? Absolutely. I just think when I just talk to people in the building and you mention Vonn, or they mention Vonn, the trust is there. Plus, Von's working his tail off too. He doesn't want to end up back where he was last year. He hated it there. He hated it in Carolina. And he's really, really excited to be back. And I think he's trying to make the most of it.
Speaking of roster battles, we talked about wide receiver 3. We've talked a little bit here about safety. But is cornerback 2 the most important battle of training camp in terms of finding an impactful and reliable starter there? Or are we overrating what that battle might entail? Let's discuss the young cornerbacks coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. And whether you're looking for a starting safety or looking for someone for your small business, you got to get the LinkedIn Jobs right now, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals. They aren't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open for the perfect role, like starting safety or starting corner, which we're going to talk about that battle in just a bit. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not on LinkedIn, you're doing it wrong. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Join the 2.5 million that do right now. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Terms and conditions apply.
These starting corners, or the battle for cornerback 2, perhaps the most interesting, most important battle of training camp. And there are a few battles that are really interesting. I think wide receiver 3, as we discussed yesterday, was a very interesting battle to watch. But in terms of impact, your starting corners are on the field roughly 100% of the time, a little bit less. But whoever starts outside on the opposite side of Cam Taylor-Britt will be on the field more than Mike Hilton, who is probably the best player at his position in the cornerback room. But between DJ Turner and likely the primary competition being Dax Hill, at least as we understand it right now, based on everything we saw throughout the offseason program and Dax's move to the cornerback room, I wonder how much of a battle we really see here. And if it is a real battle, I do think it's one of the more important battles of camp, because figuring out who will be that other corner, such an important piece to any defense, and especially a defense looking to resolve a big play issue.
I can tell you this, there are people that will be in that starting lineup that will be on the sideline that think that it's a real battle and think that Dax has a real chance. And I agree with you, though. Like, even after hearing that and knowing that and having some of these conversations, I'm like, okay, well, how hard is it to learn outside corner in an off season? And I guess the good news is he's known since March, since really, you've had a long time. It's not like they moved him mid OTAs, but sheesh, it's just a lot for Dax. And I'm not sure you'll find a bigger believer in his skill set and his talent than me, but it's still an uphill climb in my eyes. And yet at the same time, you talk to people with the Bengals, like, yeah, it's a real competition and Dax has a real shot at winning it. And regardless, whoever the third guy is, the guy who loses is still going to play a lot, to your point. At the same time, it would be really nice if DJ Turner emerges and shows, hey, I'm under contract for the next 3 years. I can start for you. I'm going to be that guy. Or a former first rounder in Dax Hill, who's gotten yanked around and was a safety last year and had to play behind Jesse Bates, now suddenly emerges as a starting corner for you. You would take that all day long, and it would really rebuild certainly his momentum from a career standpoint, but I think his just how people view him. And that's why I think going into camp, especially fans that were down on Dax last year, go into this year with a clear mind, because you never know. Maybe he is your CB2 this year, next year, and maybe beyond that. Like that is not crazy. So I think they're going to give Dax a real shot. I think that's part of why we haven't seen them sign any big name corners or anything like that. And there's still some out there. I know Stephon Gilmore made some headlines earlier this week. So yeah, I think it's going to be a real battle, and that's going to be one from day one all the way through the conclusion. I think we're monitoring really, really closely.
When you think about the best litmus tests in terms of offense versus defense on this team, the best competition to see, like, can these guys do it in a real game? Obviously, there's different speeds in training camp practices versus preseason games versus regular season games versus postseason games. We know that, but the outside corners on this team in training camp, in teamwork, are going to go against Jamar Chase and T. Higgins a lot. I mean, there will be matchups down the depth chart for sure, but DJ Turner and Dax Hill in the offseason program didn't see those guys or saw them in walkthrough. They'll have the opportunity to play against these players that are at the top of the wide receiver depth chart in the NFL in training camp. And you couldn't ask for better competition. And the reason I bring this up is because you think back to the last few years in training camp where at various times you've heard like, oh yeah, the defensive line looks awesome, or whatever the thing is. And the question was always, well, is this the defensive line being really good, or is this issues with the offensive line? You don't have those questions with the wide receivers. If Dax Hill or DJ Turner are playing really well in training camp against Jamar Chase and or T. Higgins, you'll know that that's something tangible that you can say, yeah, that might be something real. And even though it's training camp speed, that is a real test for these guys battling it out for CB2.
We saw it last year with Cam.
Mm-hmm.
Cam and Jamar just going at it. And that was something we discussed a lot throughout camp. The other thing we saw is DJ Turner flashing some against a lot of the backup receivers. Yeah. Well, what happened? He worked his way in, and man, when he was drafted, if you'd say, hey, he's going to play starting level snaps, and they did. They were relying on him at that level. So you do find out a lot. And so we'll learn about Dax, how comfortable he is at corner, if he can. And physically, I think he can. And I don't question the mental side. It's just a really tough transition. It's asking a lot in one off season. It's not like he played outside corner all the time at Michigan, and he's just going back to it from a few years ago. Like, this is something he hasn't really done since high school. And so we'll see. But I agree with you. It's something that we can there aren't going to be many disclaimers outside of it is just camp. It's camp. It's not the regular season. But outside of that, you get to see everything. It's not like trench play where you can't necessarily judge it. Like, we'll see Dax in one-on-one situations as a cover corner. How does he handle it? We'll see DJ Turner in one-on-one situations. When the ball is there, is he going to be able to make a play on it? Is he going to be able to fight through some of the physicality stuff? We'll see. But it's a fun one. I'm excited thinking about it because it's two guys I like and get along with, and they have approached this the right way. Dax has, DJ has, from a competition standpoint. And so I think it's going to be really fun to see how it plays out.
Speaking of DJs, let's quickly cover depth in the DB room. And from an injury perspective is what I'm interested in. They're pretty excited about Josh Newton, so we shouldn't write that off. He will have his opportunity to get his training camp reps. But in terms of the players that are injured, were injured, Tyson Anderson, DJ Ivey, between the two of them, we've thought throughout the offseason Tyson Anderson should be likely ready to go for most, if not all, of training camp. DJ Ivey coming off the ACL, do we expect him to start on the PUP list?
I think he's certainly more likely than Tyson. They both could briefly, but I would say that Ivey was a tad behind, and he got hurt a little later.
Yeah,
but later. A tad behind. Yeah, you're right. Much later. Sorry, it's been a while. But yeah, he's a tad behind Tyson. But could we see both in camp? I think we could. I certainly expect to see Tyson early on.
Will be some interesting stuff, both at the top of the depth chart. And in my opinion, some of the hardest roster spots to make are going to be that last corner where there will be real battles with Allen George, Josh Newton, DJ Ivey, with Dax Hill moving to the position, Jalen Davis trying to keep his roster spot as a backup nickel, with Dax Hill potentially having position versatility if he is not the starting CB2, outside CB2. He could be challenging them to figure out where to keep roster spots, especially if they see him as a backup safety as well. If he's a backup DB of all trades, which I don't think is really the plan, that could lead to some interesting roster making decisions. And then there's Josh Newton added to the mix with Dejon Anthony, the rookie safety. There are a lot of players in these in this DB room where there will be some interesting roster battles at the back of the roster as well. The other front of roster battle or significant personnel change that I think we really need to focus on is the conflux or combination of players that the Bengals will try to use to replace the production they got from DJ Reader and help right this run defense, which had its issues last year as well. We'll touch on the defensive line to finish up the show coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. Well, I never want them to stop. But playoffs, well, they wound down in the NHL and NBA. And you look around in baseball, well, it's the All-Star break. And we have fewer games right now. But that doesn't mean that FanDuel is taking a break, because FanDuel is hooking up customers with a boost or a bonus daily. All customers, not just new customers. If you've been a FanDuel customer for years, great. You're getting bonuses daily. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And maybe you want to get in on the Bengals' odds of winning the Super Bowl this year. Well, you can. Right now, they have the 5th best odds. They're tied with the Philadelphia Eagles, behind the Chiefs, 49ers, Ravens, and Lions at plus 1,400, tied with the Eagles. So go to FanDuel.com right now. Get started today. Get in all the action and don't miss any of the bonuses they have for you this summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
This defensive line has some big questions to answer, James. There was a stat posted in the last week as to the Bengals' run defense splits with DJ Reader on and off the field last year. DJ Reader was still doing a lot of work for this team. That was Matt Williamson. Last year, the Bengals were the number 1 run defense in the NFL with DJ Reader on the the last 2 years with DJ Reader on the field. First in yards per carry, first in EPA per run, but with Reader off the field, they were 32nd in yards per carry and 31st in EPA, expected points added per run against. Those are some stark splits with DJ Reader on and off the field. We've talked a lot about his impact to this team in general in the last few years, and he is no longer with the Cincinnati Bengals as he was recovering from another quad injury. The Detroit Lions decided to make that move and meet the contract demands of DJ Reader. The Bengals not apparently comfortable enough with the injury recovery or the age or the combination thereof to bring him back, and instead they pivot to, well, another player who is, from an age perspective, a little bit of a surprise, in Sheldon Rankins, and a couple of draft picks in Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson to join BJ Hill on that defensive line. Also banking on a return to form for Sam Hubbard, an additional step for Miles Murphy on the edge positions, but focusing on the defensive interior. There's 3 players there: Chris Jenkins, McKinley Jackson, Sheldon Rankins, who in different ways will need to pick up snaps and workload and the ability to play at a high level that the Bengals lost with DJ Reader with DJ Reader's departure, if they want to return to some semblance of an effective run defense.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge question. I honestly think, what are you more worried about, their passing defense or their run defense?
I mean, from a down-to-down perspective, I would say it must be run defense. I mean, there's the explosive play issue, but that also applies to the run game.
Yep. And to me, if you're allowing teams to run the ball, it's going to set up the explosive plays anyways, a lot of times. So it's tough. I think, man, and by the way, it would be tough if they kept DJ. I just to be clear here, and I like DJ a lot. If they had kept him, we'd still be talking, all right, can he be the same guy? But when will he be ready? He's going to start on PUP. I'm 95% sure he's going to start training camp on PUP for the Lions. So will he be ready for week 1? Would have been a whole storyline that we would be having here. Instead, it's, all right, well, can Chris Jenkins come in and make an instant impact? And I think the Bengals believe he can. Can McKinley Jackson be not DJ Reader, but give you, at least on short yardage downs, a guy that can be a space eater and be a problem? I think the Bengals like some of what they saw in that area when he was in college, but it's tough. And that's why it's just really, really hard to envision a scenario where we're looking at this defensive front and saying, oh yeah, well, they replaced DJ Reader. I think they're going to have some tricks up their sleeve or tweaks, and in what that looks like, how this defensive front looks. That's a storyline for sure, because look, we know Sheldon Rankins is going to start alongside BJ Hill. Yeah, we know you have 2nd and 3rd round picks waiting, and maybe not waiting and playing a lot and part of that rotation. Is that enough? I think that's going to be a storyline that starts to get answered on September 8th when Ramondre Stevenson is probably getting 25 touches. He just signed an extension with the Patriots. I'm sure they're going to give him 25 touches on the road with a potential rookie quarterback starting. So it'll get tested early on, and it's a huge, huge question mark going into training camp that, unlike corner, where we'll probably get the answer in practice, it's going to be hard to get that answer, get that full answer in practice.
You'll get a feel for it maybe a little bit in the joint practices. You won't get a feel for it at all until pads come on. And I'm sure we'll have questions in the first week of training camp, like how do those new defensive linemen look? How's Sheldon Rankins look? How's Chris Jenkins look? They're not wearing
How do they
pads.
move? Yep.
How do they move? They look like they move like NFL players. Great. And then we'll see them in pads later on. They'll be able to actually, do some trench player stuff where you don't really do trench player stuff a whole lot. I mean, there's work obviously for these guys early in training camp, but there's a reason that I'm not going to be in Cincinnati for training camp until the pads come on. And it's because the whole tone of practices changes at that point, and what they do in practices changes at that point.
Man, you know why you're waiting to come to training camp until then. You got that discounted flight.
No.
You got that disc. I know.
No, sir. There was no discount.
You
That is not how that works.
You flying in that private jet like Joe Burrow,
huh? Like maybe economy plus if I'm lucky. We're flying in the back of the plane. But
me too. I always get basic for me, please.
Yeah. I wish that those basic seats had just like a couple more inches of legroom.
Well, I'm wider than you, bro. So I'm so if I get the middle seat, I'm always touching both people next to me. It's the
middle
worst.
Seat. Oh my god!
Like if I do,
last time I flew in the middle seat.
Sometimes you get those. Sometimes
I will pay to not sit in the middle. Whenever.
So you pick your seat every time.
I mean, to some degree, yeah. Whenever possible.
Okay. See, I very rarely do I pay for a seat. I've had to a couple of times when I was flying with little one, but that's it.
Anyway, looking for the next crop of Bengals interior defenders here. I think that it will be interesting to see how the depth chart kind of shakes out throughout training camp, because I think likely we're going to see Zach Carter still getting a lot of snaps with the quote unquote second team, quote unquote first team when they go 3 defensive tackles early on, because that's how this team tends to work with rookies is not just handing them jobs right away, making them earn it through their play on the field throughout practices. So I want to see Chris Jenkins go in there and take those snaps over sooner than later. I want to see him hit the ground running and be working with those first and second units in various packages pretty quickly. I want to see him when the pads come on, being a problem on the interior, being that playmaker, even if it's not necessarily as a pass rusher right away, which is where he was less focused and less effective in college, although he's not like a strictly bad pass rusher by any means. Where he was highlighted as a playmaker, you go back to our conversation with Steve Palazzolo after the draft from PFF, is as a run defender, where he's filling up the stat sheet in run defense. And that is where my focus is. They do still need an interior pass rusher. I think Sheldon Rankins should give them some of that. BJ Hill can continue to give them some of that. They don't have the game wrecker inside per se. And they could have gone that way in the draft if they wanted to. They could have drafted for that ceiling with Johnny Newton, Jerzon Newton. Johnny Newton, who's I think on an injury list now himself, as he had a foot issue. But instead,
would you trade Amarius Mims? Would you trade Amarius Mims for Jerzon Newton right now? Look at me just putting up.
I don't know. Because he's injured, especially not because he's injured. Like that makes it an easier call in a year from now. I don't know, maybe.
He's in Washington.
Because then you'd have to consider what offensive lineman they pick in the second round, if any, where they pick Chris Jenkins instead. But looking for Chris Jenkins to get onto the field early in training camp, I think, will be a good sign for his potential to make an instant impact for this team.
Can you imagine sitting in the middle seat in between Amarius Mims and McKinley Jackson?
No, sir.
There is no middle seat in that scenario.
Yeah. What do you
want middle seat? What you talking about? What are you talking about? That's a situation where, yeah, I'll buy. But usually I get lucky and just get assigned a window or an aisle.
Yeah.
So very rarely is it middle, just to be clear.
That's going to do it for this episode.
What? What? I expect Chris Jenkins to carry himself well and make an impact right away. Expectations are pretty high for him. Like I think he should have the biggest impact of any of the rookies from an instant impact playing time standpoint. And I think Burton's in there. I think there are a bunch of guys, but I think Chris Jenkins is right there.
Yeah.
As far as where my expectations are.
And as far as like an X factor, if McKinley Jackson hits the ground running and exceeds
Mhm.
expectations, that would be one of the biggest positives for the Bengals to come out of camp. If McKinley Jackson is just ready to go and ready to play, solid run defense snaps right away. I think that might take some time, but if it doesn't take some time, that would be a big boon for this defense that needs answers, like we've talked about, to shore up that run defense. That is going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Appreciate all you everydayers out there who made it all the way through the end of this episode. And if this is the end of your first listen, you can check out the 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, Locked On Sports Today, for your second listen here, and stay on the Locked On Podcast Network. Tomorrow, we will get into some extensions we'll be watching throughout training camp and the special teams battle that we will have our eyes on. That'll wrap up our training camp previews, and then it'll be, before you know it, Mock Turtle Soup time. That's coming in no time. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.